The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the dry earth into a bed of cracked bones. Poker Alice shifted the weight of the water pail against her hip, feeling the sun scorch her already burnt skin through the thin cotton of her dress. The hem brushed against the parched grass, stirring up little clouds of dust with each heavy step. The spring was nearly dry. She'd known it before she left the cabin, but hope had a cruel way of tugging a body forward even when common sense screamed to stay put. The world stretched around her, endless, empty, punishing. The only sounds were the scratch of the wind and the faint buzz of unseen insects gnawing at the silence. Halfway back she spotted him. At first she thought it was an animal, something dragged low and broken across the ground. But as she drew closer, a shape took form. A man sprawled face down in the dirt, his skin darker than any settler she'd ever known, his chest barely rising. His clothes were torn and stained with blood, dust caking his black hair. An arrow shaft protruded from his thigh, snapped in half. Poker Alice froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. A Navajo. Her father's voice rang loud in her memory. You see one out here alone, he's the bait. Others won't be far behind. Logic begged her to back away. To turn. To run. Instead she moved closer. The smell hit her first, coppery blood, sweat baked by the sun, a sour tang of fear. His lips were cracked, his tongue dry and stuck to the roof of his mouth. His body was no threat. Not now. Not like this. Still, her hands trembled as she knelt beside him. You got no right being here, she whispered, as if words could shield her from consequence. Poker Alice dipped her fingers into the warm water she carried and dribbled a few drops onto his lips. He flinched at the touch, a soft groan rising from his battered chest. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Don't you dare die after I walked all this way, she muttered under her breath, pulling the scarf from her neck. She tore a strip and pressed it against the worst of his wounds, wincing as she worked. The desert stretched wide and empty around them, but Poker Alice knew better than to trust its silence. She had minutes, maybe less, before someone, or something, noticed the buzzard circling. Lord help me, she gritted. I'm gonna regret this. Her legs ached from dragging him across the uneven ground, muscles screaming protest. She made it to the sparse cover of scrub near the path, then paused, chest heaving. Her cabin was still a good mile off. No way she'd make it carrying him the whole way. The man stirred, his voice a low rasp. Water, he croaked. Already gave you some, she snapped, half panicked, half furious at herself for this stupidity. Ain't no sense in asking for what's running out. But she tipped the pail again, letting him sip from her cupped hand. His mouth moved in a word she didn't understand. Not English, not Spanish either. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a curse. The sky darkened slightly, a thin shadow passing over them. Poker Alice's heart dropped into her boots. She looked up, just a hawk riding the thermals. But the message was clear enough. Predators circled the weak. She made the decision before she could talk herself out of it. Bracing her shoulders under his weight, she hauled him upright, one step, then another, nearly buckling under the strain. The cabin came into view at last. A squat, weathered thing stitched together with stubbornness and prayers. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin, tired ribbon. Inside, she kicked open the trapdoor to the root cellar and lowered him into the cool darkness. He moaned as she jostled him, but she didn't stop until he was hidden below. She yanked a dusty quilt over him for warmth, then closed the door, the wood thudding hollowly. Only then did she allow herself to collapse against the wall, gasping. Sweat dripped into her eyes, stinging. Her hands were raw, scraped from the rough fabric of his clothes and the splinters of the cellar door. Her heart hadn't stopped racing since she first saw him. The sun dipped lower. Long shadows crept over the land like reaching fingers. Poker Alice loaded her old rifle, the one her father left her, and sat by the window peering out into the dying light. Every gust of wind, every creak of a branch, set her nerves jangling like a wire about to snap. She whispered under her breath, "You better live, Navajo. Otherwise, I'll be haunting you on the other side." She didn't know when sleep took her. One minute she was staring out at the emptiness. The next, a sound woke her, a low, rumbling vibration that hummed through the floorboards. She sat up fast, heart lurching. Through the narrow crack in the door she saw them. A line of horsemen, emerging from the dust like ghosts. Feathers in their hair, spears and rifles cradled loosely in their arms, silent and terrible as the judgment day itself. At least a dozen. They spread out around the cabin, a slow, deliberate circle. The horses stomped restlessly, snorting clouds of breath into the cool dawn air. The men said nothing. They didn't need to. The message was clear enough. We know he's here. We've come for him. Poker Alice's throat tightened until she could barely swallow. Her fingers tightened around the rifle stock. She could bolt the door, fire a few rounds, maybe take one of them down before they overran her. Or she could walk out there, alone, and pray she didn't die for a kindness. You did this, Poker Alice, she thought bitterly. You gave water to a dying man. And now death's come looking for you too. She forced herself to her feet, legs shaking. A figure dismounted from the lead horse, taller than the others, face painted in stark colors, eyes like black glass. He stood there waiting. The air felt thick, heavy with dust and something older, something wild and ancient that had ruled this land long before any white man had ever dreamed of crossing it. Poker Alice drew a slow breath, feeling the dry, cracked air scrape her lungs. Then she opened the door. The sunrise behind her turned her silhouette into a flickering shadow against the worn planks of the cabin. Her rifle hung heavy in her hands, but she kept the barrel pointed down. No sense starting a fight she couldn't win. The leader watched her, unmoving. Poker Alice's voice was rough, cracked from fear and dust. I ain't looking for trouble, she said. But if you mean to bring it, best know I'll stand my ground. The warrior said nothing. He lifted one hand, palm out, fingers spread, a gesture she didn't recognize, but it didn't feel hostile. Behind her, in the cellar, the wounded man shifted, groaning faintly. Every pair of eyes snapped toward the sound. Poker Alice gritted her teeth. No use hiding it now. You want him? She said, stepping forward, daring herself to match the weight of their stares. You better listen first. He was dying when I found him. Would have been buzzard meat without me. Still silence. She could feel their judgment, heavy as iron chains. Poker Alice squared her shoulders. I'm willing to hand him over. But not till I know he ain't gonna die just 'cause I pulled that arrow out. The leader's dark eyes narrowed. A low murmur passed among the warriors, almost like a river running under the sand. Then the leader nodded once, sharp, decisive. Poker Alice let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But deep in her gut, the fear didn't ease. Not even a little. Because out here in the dust and blood, mercy was just another kind of gamble. And Poker Alice had just laid her life on the table. The cold dawn wind slid over Poker Alice's skin, raising goosebumps even under her heavy coat. She stood in the dirt outside her cabin, rifle loose in her hands, facing a dozen mounted warriors who said nothing, did nothing except wait. The man at their head watched her like a hawk sizing up a wounded rabbit. His face was painted in stripes of white and red, and across his chest hung a necklace made of polished bone. He was lean, hardened, and utterly still. Only the dark glint of his eyes betrayed the life inside him, sharp, calculating. Behind Poker Alice, the wounded Navajo groaned again, muffled under the floorboards. If they hadn't heard it the first time, they heard it now. The lead warrior dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace. He stood a head taller than Poker Alice, his presence pressing against her like a rising tide. A single word escaped his lips, rough and clipped, "Brother." Poker Alice tightened her grip on the rifle. Every nerve screamed at her to run. But she knew better. Out here, showing fear was as good as bleeding in shark water. I found him dying, she said, pitching her voice low and steady. I gave him water. I pulled out the arrow. He ain't dead yet. The leader's gaze flickered to her rifle, then back to her face. Slowly, he lowered his hand, palm outward, signaling his men to hold. A tall warrior with a weathered face and feathers in his braid rode forward, speaking in a language Poker Alice didn't know. The leader listened, nodded once, then turned his full attention back to her. You, good woman, he said, voice rough as gravel. But he is ours. Poker Alice swallowed. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought they might crack. You'll take care of him? She asked, voice hitching despite herself. The leader didn't blink. He is blood. Blood does not leave blood behind. Something in his tone, the fierceness, the pride, sent a shiver down her spine. It reminded her of how her father used to talk about family before the fever took him. Behind the warriors, movement caught her eye. A second group, about 6 settlers on horseback, approached from the direction of town. Dust plumed behind them, guns slung across their saddles. Poker Alice's stomach dropped. The settlers had seen the Navajo riders too. And unlike Poker Alice, they wouldn't bother with words first. She turned back to the leader. Listen to me, she said urgently, stepping closer. The warriors shifted, murmuring, hands brushing the hilts of their knives. The leader held up a hand, silencing them. You got trouble coming, Poker Alice said. Those men, they won't ask questions. They'll shoot first. The leader's jaw tightened. His hand dropped to the tomahawk hanging from his belt. Poker Alice hesitated, then did the only reckless, stupid thing she could think of. She shoved the rifle into his hands. His brow furrowed as he took it automatically, as if insulted and impressed at once. "You'll need it more than me," Poker Alice said, voice shaking. "But we ain't gotta fight if we don't have to." A low rumble of hooves filled the air. The settlers were close now, maybe a minute out. Shouts drifted across the dry plain. "There's Injuns at Boone's place. I see 'em. Load up, boys." Poker Alice spun, heart pounding. 6 men, rifles raised, galloping fast. Dust clouded the horizon behind them, turning the rising sun into a blood-red smear. She turned back to the Navajo. "You want to live?" she snapped. "We fight together. Or we all die alone." For a moment, time hung frozen. Then the leader smiled, a slow, grim thing, and handed the rifle back. "You fight good," he said simply. Poker Alice racked around into the chamber. "I sure hope so." The Navajo melted into cover like smoke, slipping behind rocks and the low rise of the land, moving with a speed and silence that made Poker Alice's skin prickle. Poker Alice dashed for the side of the cabin, dropping to one knee. Her hands trembled, but she pressed the butt of the rifle into her shoulder, forcing the fear down. The settlers thundered in, pulling up hard, dust swirling around their horses' legs. Their leader, a wide man with a red face and a battered shotgun, bellowed at her. "Boone, get inside now. We'll handle this." Poker Alice rose slowly, rifle pointed down but ready. "They ain't here to fight," she called back. "Let them take their wounded and go." The settlers laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You gone soft, Boone? They're just waiting to scalp us soon as our backs are turned." A shot rang out, a warning round into the dirt by her feet. Poker Alice flinched but stood her ground. "Move aside, woman," the leader barked. "Ain't no place for traitors in this valley." Another shot cracked from behind her, not at the settlers but into the air, a sharp report that echoed across the plain. The Navajo made their presence known, rifles gleaming in the morning sun. They outnumbered the settlers but not by much. It was about to turn ugly fast. "Don't be a damn fool," Poker Alice shouted. "You start this fight, nobody's gonna see tomorrow." But fear ruled men's hearts quicker than reason. One of the settlers, a twitchy young man barely out of boyhood, jerked his rifle up, eyes wide and wild. The leader shouted, "Hold your fire." Too late. The boy squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but it was enough. The valley exploded into noise. Gunfire roared. Horses screamed. Dust boiled up around them, blinding Poker Alice as she hit the ground, rolling toward the shelter of the woodpile. Bullets tore splinters from the cabin wall above her head. She fired back instinctively, not aiming to kill, just to drive them back. The Navajo warriors moved like wolves, swift and coordinated, flanking the settlers with frightening precision. Poker Alice caught a glimpse of the young settler tumbling from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Another settler's horse bolted, riderless. The leader, red-faced and cursing, tried to rally his men, but panic spread faster than fire in a dry barn. One by one, the settlers turned tail and fled, pounding back toward town, their courage scattered to the wind. Silence fell, broken only by the labored breathing of the horses and the distant rattle of retreat. Poker Alice lay still for a moment, heart hammering, ears ringing. Slowly she rose. The Navajo leader approached, a shallow cut bleeding from his temple where a bullet had grazed him. He carried himself with the easy grace of a man who expected death but didn't fear it. He stopped a few paces from her, studying her like she was a puzzle with no right answer. "You fight brave," he said. Poker Alice gave a half-laugh, half-cough. "Ain't brave. Just stupid." A ghost of a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. One of the other warriors called out in their tongue, pointing toward the wounded man hidden in the cellar. Poker Alice followed, heart twisting. The young Navajo she'd saved was awake, blinking groggily, pain etched deep into his features. His brother, or maybe his blood brother, knelt beside him, speaking softly. Poker Alice watched, feeling something shift inside her. Something deep and old as the land itself. She had crossed a line today. There was no going back to town now, no easy life waiting with the other settlers. Even if she lived through this, she would always be a traitor in their eyes. But looking at the wounded man's hand closing around his brother's wrist, seeing the life she'd helped save, Poker Alice felt a fierce, stubborn pride swell inside her. The Navajo leader turned to her. "You have no home here now," he said, not unkindly. Simply stating fact. Poker Alice nodded. "Never really did." He studied her for a long moment, then gestured toward the wide, empty land stretching beyond the valley. "Come," he said. With us. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a plea. It was an offer. Poker Alice looked back once at her cabin. The broken shutters, the bullet holes, the familiar worn shape of it against the rising sun. Home had never been four walls and a roof. Home was where you stood your ground. Where you chose who to fight for. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and stepped forward without hesitation. The warriors parted silently to let her pass. As she mounted a spare horse and rode out with them into the golden light, Poker Alice knew she wasn't running away. She was finally riding toward something worth fighting for. The smoke rose behind them, a black smear against the pale sky, marking the place Poker Alice used to call home. Her horse picked its way carefully across the broken ground, following the others in a tight line. Each hoofstep stirred little clouds of dust, the rhythm steady, almost hypnotic. The Navajo warriors moved with silent urgency, never looking back. Poker Alice kept her head high, refusing to glance over her shoulder, though her heart ached. What was left behind was ashes. She needed to remember that. Chayton, the tall warrior who had first spoken to her, rode slightly ahead, scanning the horizon. His presence was a steady weight beside her, like a stone in a rushing river. She didn't know what he thought of her, this pale-skinned woman dragging trouble behind her, but he hadn't pushed her away yet. That was something. The wounded man she had saved, Chayton's younger brother named Taza, rode slumped between two older warriors, his face pale, teeth clenched against the pain. Poker Alice caught his gaze once. He didn't smile, but he dipped his head slightly, a gesture of thanks. It warmed her more than the rising sun. Ahead, the land cracked open into a series of rocky gullies and hidden ravines. Good country for hiding and for fighting if it came to that. The group slowed, pulling into a hollow ringed with low stone outcrops. Chayton dismounted, speaking quietly to his men. Poker Alice slid from her horse, knees buckling a little from exhaustion, but she stayed upright. Pride stitched her spine straight. They needed to rest. Needed to plan. Poker Alice knew it as sure as she knew her own name. Trouble didn't just burn out with a cabin. It followed like a bloodhound on a scent. One of the warriors, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, passed her a canteen without a word. Poker Alice took it, nodding her thanks, and drank deep. The water was lukewarm and tasted of leather, but it might as well have been the finest wine. Chayton approached, rifle slung across his back, arms crossed. He studied her with the same measuring look he had when they first met. "You fight settlers," he said as if trying to piece her together. Poker Alice wiped her mouth and shrugged. "Fought men who'd kill anyone they didn't understand. Seems fair." He grunted, a sound halfway between amusement and disbelief. "You leave your world," he said. "Now you have no world." It wasn't cruelty. Just truth. Poker Alice let out a low breath, feeling the weight of it settle on her shoulders. She thought of the little church in town, the whispering women, the way men spat at her father for marrying a half-Mexican woman before he died. She thought of the narrow, pinched faces staring at her from behind curtained windows. "I didn't belong to that world," she said simply. Chayton's lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him yet. Then his face turned grim. "More settlers will come," he said. "Guns. Fire." He glanced at the wounded Taza, then back at Poker Alice. "They want war." Poker Alice's jaw tightened. "Then we give them one they won't forget." Across the hollow, warriors began preparing. Checking rifles. Sharpening blades. Binding wounds. Poker Alice watched, feeling a strange, fierce energy rise inside her. She was no warrior. She was a woman who had learned to skin a deer, to shoot straight, to mend her own clothes with bleeding fingers. But out here, survival was all that mattered. Skills she thought worthless became weapons. Smoke drifted on the breeze, not from the fire they'd left behind but fresh. Too much to be from a cooking fire. Poker Alice's gut twisted. Chayton saw it too. His body went tense. "They come," he said. There was no time for grand speeches. No time for plans drawn in the dirt. The warriors moved like a single creature, fluid and deadly. Poker Alice grabbed her rifle, heart hammering, and followed them into the rocks. The settlers came on horseback, a dozen strong, kicking up dust clouds behind them. Barton Clay led them, his red face twisted with anger, a battered rifle resting easy across his saddle. Poker Alice crouched behind a boulder, pressing her back against the stone. Her palms sweated against the rough wood of the rifle. The world shrank to the beat of her heart and the feel of the earth trembling under the hooves. A signal passed silently among the Navajo, a hand gesture, a nod. Poker Alice watched, absorbing it without understanding the language but somehow knowing the meaning. Wait. The settlers thundered into the hollow, shouting curses and threats. Chayton stepped out first, rifle held high, empty hands open. An offer. A chance to walk away. Barton Clay spat into the dust. You hiding behind savages now, Boone? He bellowed. You always were too soft to survive. Poker Alice rose from cover, rifle steady. Her voice rang across the hollow, clear and sharp. Turn back, Clay. You ain't wanted here. A ripple of laughter broke among the settlers. You think you can scare us, girl? Barton sneered. You're alone. Chayton's warriors rose as one, stepping into view. Shadows among the rocks, rifles gleaming. Barton's face lost a little color. Last chance, Poker Alice said, leveling her rifle. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then Barton Clay did what cowards always do. He acted out of fear. He fired. The shot went wide, but it shattered the fragile line between talk and blood. Rifles cracked, thunder rolling through the hollow. Horses screamed and bolted. Settlers dived for cover behind rocks. Dust and gunpowder choked the air. Poker Alice squeezed the trigger. A settler yelped and dropped his rifle, clutching his bleeding hand. Bullets whined past her ear. She ducked, reloaded, fired again. Chayton moved like smoke, swift and merciless. A settler charged him with a hatchet. Chayton sidestepped and dropped him with the butt of his rifle. Poker Alice crawled behind a fallen log, firing at shapes in the dust. A bullet grazed her arm, burning hot. She bit down a cry, gritting her teeth. Across the field, she spotted Barton Clay trying to rally his men, waving them forward like a drunken general. Poker Alice lined up the shot. Barton spotted her too late. Her bullet punched through the brim of his hat, sending it spinning into the dirt. Barton dropped flat, crawling for cover. The settlers' courage broke. They fled, scrambling onto their horses, dragging the wounded behind them. Poker Alice lowered her rifle slowly, chest heaving. The silence after the battle was thicker than the gun smoke. Bodies littered the ground, settlers and horses alike. Poker Alice stood slowly, blood trickling down her arm, watching the survivors disappear over the ridge. Chayton approached, his face unreadable. You fight good, he said again, but this time there was respect in his voice. Poker Alice looked around at the battered, bloody survivors standing with her. Her chest ached with exhaustion, pain, and something fiercer, pride. She had fought. Not for land. Not for pride. For something better. For loyalty. For life. The sun rose higher, painting the rocks gold and blood red. The smoke from her burned cabin drifted higher into the clear sky. Chayton touched her shoulder, a rare gesture of familiarity. Come. We leave. Poker Alice nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking forward, through fire, into something new. As she gathered her things and turned to follow the warriors into the rising sun, she didn't look back. The past was ashes. The future, whatever it was, would be written in fire and dust. The wind stirred the ashes where Poker Alice's cabin once stood. Nothing remained but blackened beams and shattered glass, half buried in the churned-up dust. She watched the smoke trail thin into the wide blue sky, a last whisper of a life she had outgrown. The warriors moved around her, gathering their wounded, tending to horses, speaking in low voices. No one rushed. They had learned patience in a land that showed no mercy. Every movement was deliberate, practiced, as if the earth itself might punish them for carelessness. Chayton knelt beside Taza, checking his brother's wounds with gentle hands. The younger man breathed easier now, his fever broken, the worst of the danger past. Poker Alice sat cross-legged nearby, cleaning her rifle with slow, methodical care, the repetitive motion grounding her against the whirlwind inside her chest. Chayton glanced up, his eyes catching hers across the distance. In that look there was no judgment. No pity. Only acknowledgement. She had fought. She had stood. She had bled for them. Now she belonged to no one, and yet somehow she belonged here. The sun slid lower, gilding the rocks with molten light. In the fading warmth, the warriors prepared to move again. They would not linger where death had walked. Poker Alice understood that now, deep in her bones. Chayton approached, his footsteps soft in the dust. You ride with us, he said, not as a question but as a truth already decided. Poker Alice nodded, feeling the weight of it settle into her shoulders and lift her heart at the same time. She strapped her rifle across her back, rising to stand beside him. The group set out as twilight deepened, riding in loose formation across the broken land. The horses' hooves made no sound against the hard earth. Shadows stretched long across the valley, swallowing the wounds and scars of the battlefield behind them. They rode until the stars pricked the sky, cold and distant. The world shrank to the sound of breathing, the creak of leather, the soft jingle of bridles. At a small spring hidden by scrub, they made camp. Fires were forbidden, too dangerous with angry men still hunting the horizon, so they ate cold and silent, wrapped in cloaks against the gathering chill. Poker Alice sat a little apart, gazing at the stars. They burned fierce and white, scattered like spilled salt across the heavens. She remembered sitting by her cabin once, wishing on stars that never answered. Now she needed no wishes, only will. Chayton joined her, sinking to his haunches with the easy grace of a man born to the wild. "You choose hard road," he said after a while, voice low. Poker Alice smiled faintly. "Ain't no other kind worth walking." He grunted approval, then studied her with a solemnity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "Tomorrow we go deeper into mountains. Hard country. Safe country." "I'll keep up," she said, fiercer than she intended. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You will." They sat in silence after that, the stars turning slowly overhead, the night breathing around them. When sleep finally claimed Poker Alice, it was not the thin, haunted sleep of fear. It was deep and dreamless, anchored in the knowledge that she had chosen her path with open eyes. Morning broke hard and fast. A scout returned, breathless, warning of riders on the horizon, not settlers but soldiers from the nearest fort. Word of the fight had traveled faster than any of them had expected. There was no time for careful retreat. The warriors saddled up, swift and sure. Poker Alice tightened the straps on her horse, checking her rifle, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Chayton rode to her side. "You ride close. You see chance, you run." She shook her head. "I'm done running from cowards." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, a warrior's salute. The soldiers crested the ridge, banners snapping in the wind, rifles gleaming under the hard morning sun. They formed a line across the valley mouth, cutting off the easiest escape. Poker Alice felt the old familiar fear rise, a cold knot twisting her gut, but she forced it down. Fear had ruled her once. No more. Chayton signaled, sharp and crisp. His warriors spread out, moving low and fast across the rocks, becoming part of the land itself. Poker Alice followed, keeping her body low, heart hammering in her ears. The soldiers called for surrender, their voices harsh and commanding. Barton Clay, riding at their side, pointed directly at her, shouting, "There she is, traitor. String her up with the rest." Chayton gave her a glance, questioning, almost apologetic. Poker Alice raised her rifle and answered with fire. The first soldier jerked backward, screaming, his rifle clattering from his hands. The line wavered. The warriors struck then, swift and brutal, using the rocks and gullies to their advantage. Gunfire roared, smoke filling the valley. Poker Alice moved with them, every sense honed sharp as a blade. She fired, reloaded, moved, fired again, always staying close to cover, always keeping Taza and the others in her sight. She caught a glimpse of Barton Clay trying to rally the soldiers, his face red and twisted with rage. She set her sights on him, breathing slow and even. When she fired, it wasn't hate that guided her hand. It was justice. Clay screamed as her bullet shattered his shoulder, knocking him from his horse. He writhed in the dust, his cries lost in the chaos. The soldiers' line broke under the pressure, scattering in panic. Some fled. Others threw down their weapons and raised shaking hands. The battle ended in a wild, breathless silence. Poker Alice staggered to her feet, smoke stinging her eyes, muscles aching from the strain. Chayton stood nearby, blood seeping from a shallow graze across his ribs, but alive. His warriors gathered around him, battered but triumphant. Taza limped to Poker Alice's side, leaning heavily on a staff. "You fight like spirit woman," he said, voice thick with admiration. Poker Alice smiled through the pain. "Just stubborn." The surviving soldiers were rounded up, stripped of weapons and sent back toward the fort on foot, a hard lesson carved into their pride. The warriors would move again, deeper into the wilderness where no army dared follow. But for now they had won a breath of freedom. As the sun climbed higher, Poker Alice climbed a ridge overlooking the battlefield. Below her, smoke curled lazily into the bright sky. The valley stretched wide and broken, scarred by fire and blood, but still standing, just like her. Chayton joined her, silent. Together they watched the land heal itself, slow and stubborn as all wild things must. "You have name with us now," Chayton said at last. "Kiona. Stands for Brown Hills. Strong. Steady." Poker Alice felt her throat tighten. She had no words, but she nodded, accepting it with the solemnity it deserved. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair, carrying away the last ashes of her old life. She didn't know what waited ahead, hardship, hunger, maybe death. But she knew she would meet it standing tall. Out here, survival was the only law. And Poker Alice, Kiona now, had proven herself worthy. As the warriors mounted and rode into the heart of the wild land, Poker Alice turned her horse and followed, her rifle across her back, her heart fierce and free. The dust swallowed their trail behind them, erasing the past. Only the future lay ahead, raw, untamed, and waiting. The wagon wheels creaked over the cracked earth, their mournful song rising into the thick, peach-colored twilight. Dust clung to the hems of her dress, clotted at the corners of her eyes, settled like fine sorrow in her lungs. Ella May sat stiff-backed on the worn seat, one hand fisting the edge of her mother's shawl, the other cradling a battered letter that had grown thin from so much touching. The road ahead was little more than a suggestion, a thread pulled loose across a vast and empty tapestry. Her mother's words clung to her mind like the last leaves of autumn, trembling but stubborn. Go, Ellie. Make a life where no one knows the pieces you've had to pick up. Find a place the past can't follow. The horses pulled steadily, their ribs shifting like shadows beneath their skin, and the town at the horizon grew clearer, less a hope and more a certainty she could no longer run from. Ella May swallowed against the tightness in her throat. She was no one's dream. Not even her mother's, not really. Only a stand-in, a desperate replacement sent west to honor a promise her mother could no longer keep. She thought of the way her mother's hands had trembled as she pressed the letter into her palms, her breath rattling thinly in a body that had given everything it had. The town looked smaller up close. Dull wooden fronts slumped against each other like tired old men, windows squinting into the fading light. A general store with a sun-bleached awning. A saloon leaking laughter too thick and loud. A church spire tilted ever so slightly to one side, like even the heavens had grown weary of standing straight. She climbed down awkwardly when the wagon jerked to a stop in front of the station house. Her knees wobbled, her feet uncertain. Men leaned against the railing, idly chewing tobacco, hats tipped low against the heat. Eyes found her quickly, ran over her like tally marks on a ledger. Jeb Carter stood apart from them, tall and wide and full of the kind of certainty that did not welcome questions. His boots were polished. His mustache trimmed neat. His arms crossed over his chest in a manner that said he had already made up his mind about whatever lay ahead. A man who believed himself owed something simply because he had asked. Ella May approached, the letter trembling in her hand. She held it out like a peace offering, her voice soft, nearly swallowed by the rattle of the dry wind. Sir, my name's Ella May. My mother Ruth, she fell ill. She couldn't make the journey. She sent me in her place. She spoke of the arrangements. I've come to honor them. Jeb Carter didn't take the letter. His eyes sharpened like broken glass. His mouth twisted. You're not her, he said, voice flat as a blade. She was a woman full-grown, hardy, capable. You're a scrap. The words hit harder than fists. Around them, the small crowd shifted, eager for the spectacle, eyes gleaming with the kind of hunger that only surfaced when someone else's pain promised a momentary escape from their own. I can work, she said quickly, heart hammering. I can learn. I'm strong, truly. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. Strong? Girl, you look like a stiff breeze might break you clean in half. I sent for a wife, not another mouth to feed. The letter slipped from her fingers, forgotten in the dust. She wanted to explain, to plead, but pride rooted her feet to the earth. She had been sent here not to beg but to build. And if he could not see the worth stitched quietly into her bones, then he never would. Jeb Carter turned on his heel, spat into the dirt, and walked away without a backward glance. The murmuring grew louder. A few women clucked their tongues. A man laughed under his breath. Someone muttered, "Fool girl, thinkin' she could trick him." Ella May bent slowly, gathering the letter with fingers that shook too much. She tucked it back into her shawl, her mother's shawl, a fragile armor against the gaping loneliness spreading through her chest. No room at the inn for charity cases, the woman behind the counter said when Ella May inquired. Not without payment. Triple maybe for the trouble. She wandered the edges of the town until she found a shed left to rot behind the livery. It leaned dangerously against the night, ribs bared where planks had split. But it was shelter of a sort. She curled up on a pile of old horse blankets, the smell of leather and old hay thick around her. The stars wheeled slowly above, vast and cold, indifferent to the small ruin of a girl below. Somewhere an owl called out, low and mournful. The wind slipped through the cracks in the shed like an old woman's sigh. Ella May pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, rocking slightly, humming tunelessly under her breath. She remembered her mother's lullaby, the one sung on nights when the world seemed too wide and cruel for a little girl to bear. She remembered her mother's voice whispering, "Not all things that break stay broken." Tears slid down the sides of her face, quiet as prayer beads slipping through fingers. She let them come. There was no one left to see. No one left to pretend for. The morning would come, harsh and bright. The town would find its next entertainment. She would find a way to survive because the only other choice was not to, and Ella May had never been much good at giving up. She closed her eyes, the dust of 100 hard miles still clinging to her skin. In the distance, the town exhaled and settled, a beast at uneasy rest. Somewhere out there, she thought dimly, maybe there was a place where the soil wasn't so dry, where a girl like her could plant something and watch it grow. Somewhere, but not here. Not yet. The stars kept their silent vigil as she drifted into a restless sleep, one hand curled tight around the letter she had traveled so far to deliver and the other pressed over her heart as if to keep it from slipping away into the night. And somewhere just beyond the sleeping town, a man watched from the shadows, his hat low over his brow, his breath rising in slow, steady clouds. He saw the girl abandoned like a stray dog, and though he said no words, something within him shifted, ancient and slow, like a river finding a new course after a long drought. But that is a story for another dawn. The town woke with the sun, all hard edges and busy hands, but no one spared a glance for the girl picking her way out of the abandoned shed, her shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill. Ella May moved carefully, head low, dust rising from her skirts in soft little clouds. She wore her silence like a second skin now, learned overnight how to slip unnoticed between the corners of things. The streets buzzed with the small violences of daily life. A merchant haggled too sharply over a sack of beans. A boy kicked a dog hard enough to make it yelp. A woman snapped at her daughter for dawdling. Ella May felt each sound like a stone in her pocket, weighing her down with things that had no name but pressed heavy all the same. At the general store, the clerk looked through her like she was glass. She counted out the coins her mother had hidden in the hem of her dress, her fingers clumsy from cold. Enough for a tin of beans, a few matches, a heel of bread going stale on the counter. The clerk made a noise low in his throat, the kind men made when they felt inconvenienced by your very breathing. Behind her in the narrow store, someone moved, solid and slow. She didn't turn. She had learned not to turn. Eyes brought trouble. When she placed her few sad purchases on the counter, her hands shook slightly. The clerk rang them up without looking at her, announced the cost in a voice as dry as a chalkboard. Her coins did not stretch far enough. She fumbled for the extra, her heart knocking against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't notice when another hand, large, calloused, slipped a small silver coin onto the counter. The clerk shrugged, made no comment, slid the goods into a paper bag. Ella May turned then, just enough to glimpse the man behind her. He was tall, sparely built, his clothes plain and well-worn, his hat shadowing his face. He didn't look at her. Didn't even seem to expect thanks. He simply nodded once, slow as the sun rising, and moved past her into the morning light. She carried the bag close to her chest, confused, wary, but warmed in some corner of her chest that had gone cold. The town saw her, but only through the crooked lens of rumor. It didn't matter that she had spoken no lies. It didn't matter that her hands were willing, that her heart had stayed soft despite the breaking. In their eyes, she was a trickster, a girl who had tried to pass herself off as something she was not. Children pointed sometimes. Old men muttered. Women clucked their tongues and turned away as she passed. She found small work where she could. Washing laundry for the widow who ran the boarding house. Sweeping floors at the livery. Carrying parcels too heavy for the shop boys. No one paid her well, but pennies stacked slow could still make a tower if you were patient enough. At night she returned to the shed. It was hers now, in a way marked by the little scraps of life she left behind. A chipped cup, a patchwork blanket stitched from discarded rags, a sprig of wild sage stuck into a crack in the wall. Sometimes she cried, but mostly she simply sat and listened to the night sounds. The lowing of cattle beyond the fields. The restless whisper of the grass. The far-off sound of a harmonica rising and falling like breath. And sometimes, when the moon was thin and sharp as a sliver of bone, she caught sight of him, the man from the store, moving through town with the careful gait of someone who had learned not to rush. Always quiet. Always alone. She asked the widow about him once, her voice no more than a thread of sound. Calder Boone, the widow said, scrubbing a dish with more force than necessary. Lost a wife years back. Ain't much for talking. Keeps to himself. The way she said it made it sound like a flaw, but Ella May thought maybe it was just a way of surviving. She knew something about that. She saw him again 2 mornings later. She was hanging laundry behind the boarding house, arms aching from the work, when he passed by leading a tired old mule. He tipped his hat to her, not smiling, not expectant, just a simple acknowledgement. A quiet thing, but it filled the space around her like sunlight slipping into a cold room. She didn't dare hope. Hope was a luxury for girls who still had fathers and soft beds and names that carried respect. Still, when the town looked at her like a stain that wouldn't wash out, Calder Boone looked at her like she was simply a person. Not a burden. Not a disappointment. Just a person. One evening, a loaf of fresh bread appeared on the steps of the shed. No note. No explanation. She found herself smiling despite the ache that lived deep in her bones now. Another time, when her old boots split at the seams, she discovered a pair of nearly new ones tucked behind the shed, sized just right. She never caught him at it. That felt important somehow, the way he gave without asking for gratitude, the way he understood how sometimes kindness needed to be quiet to be real. Summer deepened its claws into the land. The river shrank, the fields turned brittle and yellow. Tempers in town grew short as water grew scarce. But Calder Boone remained steady as a fence post in a hard wind. She learned to watch for him the way one watches for rain clouds in a drought, with cautious, yearning hope. He was not handsome in the way Jeb Carter had been, not polished or sharp. His face was weathered, lined from years of squinting into the sun, but his eyes, when you caught them, were steady and kind and terribly lonely. She wondered what it would be like to sit across a table from him, to speak without flinching, to be seen and not judged. She wondered if such things were meant for girls like her. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, she sat by the shed door, sewing a patch onto her dress by the last scraps of daylight. Calder Boone passed by, leading the mule again, and paused. "You sew," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. She nodded, throat too tight for words. "I got some shirts need mending," he said after a long moment. "Pay you fair." She swallowed past the lump in her throat and nodded again. "Bring 'em by tomorrow," she managed to say. He touched the brim of his hat and moved on. The night wrapped itself around her like a shawl woven from hope and fear. She stitched the final thread into her dress with hands that shook not from weariness this time, but from something altogether more dangerous. Possibility. The town might turn its face away from her, might close its doors and whisper behind cupped hands. But out there, beyond the cracked road and the bent spire of the church, something was waiting. Something slow and patient and steady as the stars wheeling overhead. Someone, who saw her not as a mistake, not as a fraud, but simply as a soul trying to make a life in a world that had never made space for her. And for the first time in a long, long while, Ella May dared to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was worth being seen. The bundle of shirts arrived the next morning, folded neatly in a canvas sack and left by the shed door, as if even the delivery was meant to spare her pride. Ella May ran her fingers over the worn fabric, calloused fingertips catching on tears and frayed edges. Shirts that had seen long days in the fields, shirts that carried the faint scent of wood smoke and wild sage. She worked carefully, each stitch a small act of stubborn hope. She mended them with the same care her mother had once used mending their clothes back east, not simply repairing cloth, but stitching dignity back into worn seams. When Calder Boone returned 2 days later, he stood a ways off, as if unsure whether he was truly welcome. Ella May stepped out of the shed with the shirts folded over her arm and offered them up without a word. He nodded once, slow, solemn, the kind of nod that carried more weight than whole conversations. "Good work," he said simply, passing her a small pouch heavy with coins. She should have refused. Pride and caution warred within her. But something steadier, something hungrier, rose up and took her hand instead. She accepted the pouch and murmured a thank you so quiet it might have been the breeze. After that, it became a rhythm between them. Calder brought small tasks, mending, gardening, feeding the chickens that scratched behind his modest house, and Ella May met each one with quiet determination. Not because she wanted to earn his approval, but because the work, small as it was, made her feel anchored again, made her feel real in a world that had done its best to unmake her. His ranch sat on the edge of town, where the land stretched out into gold and gray and brittle green. The house was plain but sturdy like its owner. A deep porch wrapped around the front, shaded by a roof that groaned and whispered in the wind. Ella May learned the small geography of his world, the way the front gate squeaked low and tired, the path worn into the grass from years of quiet footsteps, the gnarled cottonwood tree that stood like a lone sentinel by the well. Calder spoke little, but when he did, his words came honest and unvarnished, like river stones worn smooth by time. "Need anything you ask?" he said one day, setting a sack of flour down by the shed. "No shame in needing." She didn't know how to answer, so she nodded, blinking back the sudden burn behind her eyes. Some evenings, when the heat pressed down heavy and unrelenting, Calder would sit on his porch with a battered guitar across his knee, picking out slow, mournful tunes that seemed to rise straight up into the stars. Ella May listened from her little shed, the music threading through the night like a promise she didn't yet dare name. Sometimes he would glance over, catch her watching, and she would look away quickly, heart thudding loud enough to rattle her ribs. But he never called her out for it. Never mocked or questioned. Just kept playing, letting the music build a bridge between them without ever demanding she cross it. There were moments, scattered and shining like pebbles in a dry creek bed, when the hardness in her chest softened. When the world felt less like a set of closed doors and more like a field just waiting for seeds brave enough to root. She began to plant things. Tiny rebellions against the dry soil and harsher odds. A row of sunflowers along the side of the shed. A patch of mint near the well. Tomatoes, stubborn and slow but growing all the same. The town still looked at her sideways. Still muttered when she passed. But she found she could meet their eyes now without flinching. Found she could wear her mother's shawl not as armor, but as memory, a badge of the battles already survived. One late afternoon, after a long day mending a torn fence line, Calder offered her a seat on the porch. Just a gesture, a tilt of his head toward the extra chair he had dragged out into the shade. Ella May hesitated, the old reflex to refuse, to flee flickering up in her chest. But the porch was wide, the sky above it endless and forgiving, and Calder Boone sat easy as a man with no need for games. She sat. They watched the sun sink low together, the sky bleeding colors too fierce and beautiful to be real. After a long while, Calder spoke, voice slow as honey. "Folks think you're trouble." She stiffened, ready to retreat behind the careful wall she had built, but he continued before she could. "They're wrong." 3 words. Nothing more. But they sank into her bones deeper than any kindness had in months. She looked at him, then really looked. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the rough hands that had built something steady out here on the edge of nowhere, the quiet weight of his gaze that saw her, not for what she wasn't, but for what she was. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat like birds startled into flight. He shrugged, a small, almost embarrassed motion. "Just saying what's true." They sat there until the stars bled into the sky, until the night grew thick and tender around them. The next morning, a small wooden box appeared by the shed. Inside, seeds. Handwritten labels in Calder's rough, careful script. Marigold, sage, beans, squash. Hope spelled out in small, steady letters. She planted them with shaking hands, tears slipping down her cheeks and watering the dry earth. The land was stubborn. Hard to coax, harder still to trust. But Ella May knew something about stubbornness, about putting down roots even when the world seemed to conspire against you. As the days stretched into weeks, the seeds took hold. Tiny shoots fought their way through the cracked soil, reaching for the sun with desperate, joyous strength. And so did she. Each evening, Calder and Ella May sat on the porch, the silence between them no longer heavy with things unsaid, but easy, companionable. Sometimes he played his guitar. Sometimes she hummed along, the notes slipping into the cooling air like small blessings. Once, as she mended a tear in his shirt by the firelight, he reached out and touched her hand. A fleeting brush, nothing more, but it lit something in her so fierce and sudden that she had to bow her head to hide it. He didn't pull away. He just let his hand rest there, warm and solid and real. And for the first time in her life, Ella May realized that love, real love, was not a thunderclap or a whirlwind or a desperate reaching. It was a hand offered quietly in the dark. It was a seed planted in dry earth, patient and stubborn and sure. It was a life built one slow, steady moment at a time. She squeezed his hand back, heart hammering, hope blooming wild and stubborn inside her chest. The town would talk. The world would keep turning hard and careless. But here, on the edge of all that noise, something true was growing. Something fierce. Something beautiful. Something theirs. The fire crackled low between them, throwing long, wavering shadows across the porch. The stars lay thick and heavy overhead, so close it seemed a man could pluck one from the sky if he dared reach far enough. Ella May sat with her knees drawn up beneath her skirt, the worn shawl draped over her shoulders, the scent of wood smoke clinging to her hair. Across the small fire, Calder Boone leaned back in his chair, his hat pushed low over his brow, his hands idle for once, resting easy on his knees. The air between them was warm, easy, filled with the quiet music of a life not rushed. And for a while that was enough. But the world beyond their small circle was not so easily kept at bay. Trouble came on a morning stitched with gold and the faint smell of rain. A rider kicking up dust along the road, his horse lathered and skittish, his voice sharp with self-importance as he barked at the townsfolk gathering near the store. Jeb Carter, back from some cattle run, heard tell of the girl he had spurned finding shelter with the likes of Calder Boone. Whispers flared to life like dry grass catching flame. Whispers of impropriety, of deception, of stolen promises. Ella May heard it first in the way the storekeeper stiffened when she entered, the way the widow's son no longer waved as she passed, the way the blacksmith's wife turned her face away, pretending not to see. Rumors grew wild and ugly in dry places, and there was no drought fiercer than the one that lived in men's small, mean hearts. By the time Calder came back from the upper pasture, the town had decided to have a meeting. A reckoning, some called it. A public accounting of sins never committed but whispered loud enough to seem real. Ella May sat on the edge of the porch, hands twisting in her lap, fear a bitter stone lodged deep in her throat. She had known this kind of cruelty before, but it still burned, still carved her open in ways she could never quite prepare for. Calder stood beside her, steady as a tree in high wind. He said nothing for a long time, simply placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Then, without hurry, without fear, he saddled his horse and helped her onto the back of it, climbing up behind her like a man simply heading into another long day's work. The town square buzzed like a hive when they arrived. Faces hard, mouths tight, judgment thick in the air. Jeb Carter stood at the center, a smirk curdling his lips, his hands planted on his hips like a man already sure of victory. "This here," Carter barked, waving a hand toward Ella May, "this is a deception, a shame upon our town. Man takes in a stray, sure, but what man tarnishes his name by playing husband without the preacher's word?" The crowd muttered, shifting on their feet, the uneasy movements of people who wanted blood but feared their own reflection. Calder dismounted slow, helped Ella May down with a care so tender it stung. He turned to face the crowd, his hands loose at his sides, his voice quiet but carrying clear over the restless murmur. "I ain't much for speech," Calder said. "Ain't much for towns neither. But I know right from wrong same as any man here." He paused, scanning the faces before him, seeing not just the anger but the fear underneath it, the gnawing hunger to belong to something even if it meant throwing stones at someone else. Ella May didn't trick nobody. She didn't lie, didn't cheat, didn't steal. She's done nothing but work honest and live quiet, same as any decent soul should. The muttering grew softer, uncertain. "As for me," Calder continued, voice like iron wrapped in velvet, "I reckon a man's worth ain't in the promises he makes when things are easy. It's in the ones he keeps when things get hard." He stepped closer to Ella May then, standing beside her not as a shield but as a partner, an equal. "I made her a promise even if I never spoke it out loud. That she'd have a home if she wanted it. That she'd have a name she could wear proud. That no hand would raise against her while I drew breath." The silence now was complete, thick and trembling. Jeb Carter spat into the dust, the only sound, but even he seemed to feel the tide turning beneath his feet. Calder turned to Ella May, his eyes steady, the firelight from the blacksmith's forge painting his face in gold and shadow. "If you'll have me," he said, voice low but sure, "I'd like to marry you proper. Not to fix anything. Not to answer any fool mouths in town. Just because I want to." Ella May felt the world tilt under her feet, a slow, gentle shift, as if the earth itself had decided to make room for her at last. Her throat closed, her heart beating so hard she thought it might shatter against her ribs. She stepped forward, close enough to touch him, to see the lines around his mouth, the hope and the fear and the endless patience woven into the way he looked at her. "I would like that," she whispered, the words fluttering out like moths into the dark. Someone in the crowd clapped, a slow, uncertain sound. Another joined, then another, until the town's judgment cracked and fell away, replaced by something quieter, something almost like respect. It was not full acceptance. It was not forgiveness. But it was a beginning. The preacher married them 2 days later, under the wide sky, with only the cottonwoods and the dry earth as their witnesses. Calder wore his best shirt, patched and clean. Ella May wore her mother's shawl, the threads mended but the love intact. They exchanged rings made of braided grass, laughing soft when the wind tried to steal them away. That night, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars bloom one by one across the endless black. Calder's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together like roots entwining beneath the soil. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and wild, but no longer empty. Ella May leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of sweat and wood smoke and something that had no name but filled her to the brim. They had planted something in the dry earth, something stubborn and fierce, something that would not break even when the storms came. Love, slow-grown and steadfast. Home, not built of walls but of hearts stitched back together. Hope, whispered into the dark and answered at last. And if you're ever standing at the edge of everything you thought you lost, if the world turns its face away and leaves you to weather the long nights alone, remember this. Sometimes it is the smallest seed, planted in the hardest soil, that grows the mightiest tree. All you have to do is dare to plant it. All you have to do is dare to believe you are worth the bloom.